I'm here today with Dr. Dawn Darwin Weeks, author of a new book titled Breakthrough, Trusting God for Big Change in Your Church from Chalice Press. Dawn is co-pastor of Connection Christian Church and a vibrant and trusted community leader in Texas Permian Basin. She's a contributor to the Unbinding the Gospel series, a popular church transformation resource, and Connection is the third century-old congregation she has led to discover bold new purpose in ministry. I'm anxious to hear about this more. You can learn more at chalicepress.com. So Dawn, welcome and congratulations on all the things that you've done.
Thank you. It's really fun to be talking with you in person. One of the things that helped me to take my writing more seriously and be more intentional about it was going to one of the workshops that Writing for Your Life offers. So I'm really delighted. This is kind of a full circle thing for me to be talking with you today.
Well, I couldn't be more delighted because, having alums, that come out with new books is just nothing could be better, right? That's exactly what the whole purpose of the project is. So I was really glad when you contacted me to tell me that this was the case.
Yes, I actually finished something. That is a hard job for writers, to finish something and let it go.
So to get started, what would you like people to know about you beyond just the really brief things that I mentioned there?
Sure. I'm a pastor at heart, and in my 26th year of ordained ministry, started out as a Southern Baptist minister, believe it or not, and then in order to have a preaching ministry and a pulpit, I became affiliated with the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in 1999. So that's been a while now.
Wow.
And my ministry has been to old churches who are becoming young again. I really felt a calling to new church ministry. Just the excitement and adventure of that really calls to me. But the way the Lord would have it, I've been in older churches that are seeking new identity and a fresh start, and just pulling on those roots that were the reason the church started and pulling them up into the present day, into a way that the church can see forward into the future has just been a great joy for me. And the reason I wrote this book is because this congregation that my husband and I have been blessed to be a part of, I think has a story that a lot of churches need to hear. It's a hard time in a lot of American Christianity, particularly in the mainline Protestant churches. And we have a story of hope, and one that introduces voices from our congregational leaders, not just voices of the pastors, that I think other congregational leaders will be encouraged and challenged to hear. So my heart is to get people who sit in the pew and pray the prayers and make the communion in touch with our people who sit in the pew and pray the prayers and make the communion, so that they might have a conversation via this book.
Wow. Wow. So before we get further into the book, you mentioned that there are three century-old churches. So before Connection, where were you at?
Well, and really it's even four. So the very first church that ever trusted me to be their pastor was a tiny little 125-year-old now church in the top of the Texas Panhandle called First Christian Church, Miami, Texas. It's spelled Miami, but they say Miami. And they called me to be their pastor. And it was such a gift. After our congregational meeting where, they interviewed me and all of that, they voted for me to be their pastor. And one of the guys, one of the leaders of that group, took me aside and said, "Now about you being a her." And I thought, oh no, I thought we'd made it, through to the other side of this. "About you being a her." And I said, "Yes," taking a deep breath and, swallowing the lump in my throat. And he said, "You just don't worry about that. We have your back."
Excellent.
Yes. And so that's how I got my start in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ for that it was then 115-year-old congregation. From there, I went to another century plus old congregation in Dallas, and that church did a relocation and a brand new start in a new suburb. And then I served in Kansas City, Missouri for the 9 years before my current location. And that was my first co-pastorate with my husband, Joe, who is PhD in New Testament and is just a great kind of counterbalance to the way I do ministry. We're a good team. And we started out doing a co-pastor because we had small children at home and it was getting to be a lot. He's also, was pastoring a church to balance two different schedules with children and to sort of know two completely different groups of people. So we said, Lord, could we maybe work together? And we did that for 9 years. And we're not looking to move, except that this very persuasive disciples of Christ, West Texas drawl, powerful woman called me on the phone one day. And when I answered the phone, everything changed.
So Permian Basin is West Texas?
Permian Basin is between Dallas and El Paso. It is the oil field that our country gets most of our oil resources out of. So a lot of very hardworking people, and everything that's here on this very desert plain has been built by people here. So it's very practical. If you're here, roll up your sleeves and get to work kind of a place.
Very cool. So I mentioned the title of the book is Breakthrough, Trusting God for Big Change in Your Church. So how did the book itself come about?
The book came about because we had done all of this work over about a 6-year period and really seen what we experienced as God moving in our church and bringing new life out of these old roots of this congregation. And we were having a capital campaign to pay down the debt as we finished up paying for the building that we have renovated here. And I just wrote down sort of the tale of how we got there. We now have more people in our church that never knew our previous locations than people who did. And so I kind of wanted to write it down so they would know the adventure that we'd been on to get to where they could feel like they could be a part. And so we gave it out to the church at that time. And then I went on a sabbatical and started just writing a little bit more here and there and thought, I'm going to throw in a book proposal on this. I mean, why not? And I did. I sent it to 3 places and Chalice Press said yes.
That's awesome. Good for you. Well, it's like the path that someone takes, right? To get a book published, whether they're publishing it themselves or publishing with a traditional publisher, is always so unique, right? And so I love to hear stories like yours where, you just started out attending a conference and then gradually started writing and gradually put together a book proposal and then got a book deal. I mean, that's just picture perfect.
There was about probably 6 months there that 3 out of 5 weekdays, I'd get up an hour and a half or so before anybody in my household did and just wrote down the memories of the journey we'd been on with the congregation. But at that time, I didn't even think, and I'm going to publish this. But once I'd written it and people had read it, I thought, I think people need to hear this story. There are people that this would encourage. And so that's when I sent the proposal off. And
so just like any publishing house and what I teach in my classes is to knowing your audience. So who was your intended audience for this?
It's a really good question. I was trying to think about pastors and dedicated church leaders who are just tired. Tired of trying to keep their churches going, tired of trying to pay the bills, tired of trying to make something, grow that doesn't seem to want to grow. And what I really wanted, there's a lot of church growth books out there. So I knew that there was no dearth of people telling them how they could do it better. What I really wanted was not do it the way we did it, but simply the hope that God can do new things still and that resurrection is still in God's wheelhouse.
So how is the book itself then different, between, other church growth books?
Right. And not to knock those, they've been helpful for me, but a church growth book is always the pastor telling you how it was done and always telling, from a leadership perspective, here's what you need to be doing. And to me, the big void there is congregational voices.
Mm.
because I don't think anything healthy happens in a church if it's just the pastor making things happen. You might get growth for a while, but when that person is gone, it's all over. There's just not any sustaining power to that. And so to me, it was really important to include multiple voices. So the way I did that is the end of every chapter, there's a leader in our congregation who puts their 2 cents in.
Mm.
And it was so fun asking these people to do this. They couldn't believe, most of them had never written for, publication before, could not believe I wanted them to write it. In fact, now that I've got the book, and first thing I did when I got it was drop it off on their front porch, in a little gift bag and say, thank you, here it is. And some of them said, I didn't know it was actually going to be printed. I mean, they just didn't have a concept. So it was so fun working with them on that. But more than anything, I wanted other people in Montana and Minneapolis, Minnesota, everywhere to hear from our people, because it's their faith, their creativity, their gumption that made us able to have the kind of transforming ministry that we have here.
Well, that's very cool, because I think it answers one of the other questions I had, which is that, the typical issue with growing big churches is that it's oftentimes the charisma of the senior pastor.
That's right.
It's driven that in the first place, which is not scalable, obviously.
It is not scalable, and does not necessarily mean the people in the congregation are growing spiritually.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Just because you've got a lot of numbers and a lot of rah-rah going doesn't mean people are really growing spiritually. And I think we're suffering the effects of that right now in our nation.
Yeah.
The Christian maturity of people to be able to hold tension and still love each other when they disagree, and things that you've written about, Brian, that is present in our congregation. And a big part of that is the teamwork of our church. Now, we're a congregational church in polity. Other churches, they have, a bishop system, that kind of thing, where congregations are appointed their pastors and they don't own their own land, and those kinds of things. So it might not be true in other kinds of churches, but for our church, it has to be a partnership between pastor and people for good things to happen. And so our people are just really good at that. And I wanted to tell their story because I think a lot of ministers and maybe leaders in the church have given up that that's possible. So it is, and we're happy recipients of it.
I mean, you mentioned kind of this kind of takes you back to more like what the church originally was, I think.
Right, sure. In the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, we have elders, and the story goes that one of our founders, Alexander Campbell, and his elders in West Virginia would try to beat each other to church, because whoever got there first would preach. In the elder group, this shared ministry.
Oh, that's great.
Yes. And of course the pastor needs authority and needs, some trust from the congregation to lead. And we have developed that. But the pastor alone cannot make things happen, nor should he or she be the one that makes things happen. It's got to be a shared journey. And I really wanted that to come across with multiple voices. And of course, my husband, Joe, is the co-pastor of our church and does a lot of the business and management aspects. And so his voice was really important to keep me honest and emphasizing things that I wouldn't have thought to emphasize as part of the whole story. So I just love the multiple voices way the book came out.
So it does make one think that maybe this is a little happy kind of a book, and not like,
right.
The tough aspects of this.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I try to say a little bit about it in the book in various ways. It took longer than we ever would have thought. We were raising our kids as teens, and from in essence, no youth group going on to, a vibrant youth group didn't happen as fast as we would have wanted just for our own kids. So there was a sense of sacrifice in that from them as well. We, of course, had people that didn't stay with us. And I don't tell that story because it's theirs to tell. the vast majority somehow made it from our downtown location to our worshiping in an elementary school cafeteria all the way to our new building and stuck with us the whole time. And so that's the story that I tell. And then I acknowledge just some of the personal difficulties. During this time, I had a breast cancer bout, and we had my husband's mother come and live in our community to deal with her Alzheimer's. So, that life happens while you're trying to lead a congregation. And the mass shooting that our community endured 3 years ago, last Wednesday, happened right outside our new location. And so I tell it in the book that really it was because we made all these changes that we were able to be of service to our community at that time. I think we would have been much more of a bystander than an upstander, as the kids say today, if we had not already done the work to be able to be poised to serve, postured to serve. And the same thing with COVID, golly, COVID's been hard on ministers and churches and church leaders. But if we had not moved, it would have been even harder. We met for 59 Sundays in our church parking lot, and we just wouldn't have even had the setup to be able to do that had we not gone ahead and taken the courage to make this big adventure. So even the hard things were made easier because we'd already been working on our courage muscles and our compassion muscles for several years.
So since you did involve, some members of your congregation in the book, I mean, has there been anybody that's felt left out of that?
That's a really good question. It was hard to narrow it down of who to include. I tried to include people that were part of really pivotal moments, like when it could have gone either way, whether or not we put the building downtown on the market to sell it. There was one man who just spoke up, very soft-spoken leader in our church, but just said, why are we hesitating? Let's trust God now. And he never says anything like that, in a group setting. And because he said it, everybody moved in the way that he was calling us to move. So I asked him to write because, he was so responsible for that. There were some I would have liked to ask to write. Ronald Bennett, who often took people to lunch if they were disgruntled about our process and would talk them down so that we as pastors didn't have to deal with them, has dementia now, is in the care home. So I would love to ask him, but I lost the window for him. So yes, there could have been so many more voices, but I think even the congregation, as best I can tell, kind of gets that that I included the right ones. I hope so.
So, as you know, lots of our audience are writers, and just like you, they've got family, a day job, lots of tugs on their time and their prioritization. How did you manage to pull off writing the book and now to however degree marketing the book in the midst of everything else that you've got going on?
Well, I'm an empty nester as of last week. So
yay.
All this energy now is coming back to me. Yes, thank you. Two things. One is a lot of the writing I've been doing for a while has been a column here, an article there, 400 word kinds of things, but that kept my muscles active at writing. And so it is not hard for me to sit down and start, right? Because I have these little projects. So I would encourage people, say yes to whatever project, you're offered, so that you can have that experience of meeting the deadline and all of that to keep those muscles going. The other thing is, I remember the first one of those small projects that I said yes to, I was telling my daughter about it. She was young at the time, maybe 7 or something. And I said, I'm not sure I really have the time to do this. And she said, you can do it, Mom. Just multitask. And so I remembered that, her little wisdom. and
So you
just
tell her that now that she's in college or wherever she
right.
is? Did you
You
tell
can
her,
do it, honey. Just
remember this?
multitask. Exactly. And for me, what that means is, yes, when I'm working on a project, getting up earlier than everybody else so the house is quiet. Of course, that'll be easier now that my two are gone, just the dog, the cat, and the husband. But earlier is my better time of day, but also grabbing the 15 minutes here or the 20 minutes there to just do a little is what helps me to keep the juices flowing and the project on my mind so that I'm kind of always working on it in a way. And when I sit down, I'm not having to move big boulders, just a few stones at a time.
So, I can imagine that, West Texas is a relatively conservative area. And here you're a female pastor in a church that is LGBTQ plus affirming.
Yes.
So what is that like?
I wrote one of the chapters about that. Y'all means all is what I titled that chapter, because we knew that we were coming to an area that mostly just had two branches of Christianity represented, the Catholic Church and the more right-wing evangelical Protestant church, probably the two that's all people think of in terms of Christianity here. But for us, there's so much more richness and diversity of Christian witness. And this church understood that from the beginning, having been a mainline Protestant church in the community for over 100 years. And so we've been about developing that identity even more and more. And so because of that, within a year after arriving here, the Supreme Court, made it legal for same-sex couples to marry in the United States. And so this church had never really discerned what to do about gay people in the church. They, like many churches, kind of had a don't ask, don't tell policy. People sort of knew someone was maybe gay, but they didn't talk about it. And so we asked the church to study that. And we did for about a year. And we just told them, what do you want us to do if a couple asks us to marry them? We'd just like to know your opinion about it. And so they studied, they prayed, and then they told us, look, we've never told our ministers who to marry, and we're not about to start now.
Interesting.
West Texas has a real practicality about it, what works. And so with that, we started tiptoeing into a more clear as kind, a more clear stance on whether or not people were truly welcome on all levels in our congregation. And those baby steps have just turned into a congregation that is very affirming and loving of LGBTQ plus people. And that spills over into all kinds of other ways, people who speak English as a second language, or, folks who are blue collar or white collar, and Republican or Democrat. We say a lot about we're the only congregation really in our area that is very clear about that broad of a tent. And it's really important to us. So I have a lot of fun living out the distinct identity that this congregation has carved out, and they're proud. They've never said about you being a her to me. That they have a female minister. This congregation back in the 1980s was the first in our community to have women elders and leaders. And,
cool.
To me, it really highlights and underlines why this congregation's witness is needed in our community, because we're the only ones really like this. And for many of our churches that are declining, that is the case. And when you look around and say, not do we as a congregation need this church, but does this community need what we represent and what we have to offer? I think the answer a lot of times is yes, badly. And so therefore we have the motivation to get ourselves back out there.
Very cool. Wow. Good for you guys. So now that you've gone through this whole process, of coming out with a new book and see what that's like, do you have any thoughts about more?
I do have a couple of things. I took some time off and studied about the oil field, and not just ecologically, but also as ministry, how the church can be more creative and compassionate towards the whole oil field
Hmm.
employment industry. And so I went to visit Norway this past summer and looked at how
Hmm.
they interact with their oil field workers and what their churches do to minister in those settings, which are often pretty devoid of any church other than
Hmm.
somebody, handing out a Bible. But no real relationship building. So that's fun to think about. And that's what I'm working on right now with a grant from the Lilly Endowment.
Oh, cool. Well, good for you. Good for you. Anything else that you'd like to pass along to our listeners?
No, just keep writing and go to a Writing for Your Life conference and see what happens to you.
Well, good for you. Thank you. Again, the title of the book is Breakthrough, Trusting God for Big Change in Your Church. You can learn more about it at chalicepress.com. Dawn, congratulations on all the fine work that you've done. And thanks for bringing this book, to see the light of day, that will hopefully help lots of other congregations.
I pray so. That is my sincere prayer. Thank you for the time today and for all you do to encourage writers.
Well, thank you so much, Dawn.